In this lesson, we'll take a look at some of the evidence that Darwin brings to bear on the question of species change. In his famous book, he's going to make one long argument against the special creation hypothesis. Now, what is the special creation hypothesis? It was the common view among Christian thinkers of the time that species had their origins from God. In other words, God designed different kinds of species for life in a certain habitat and then created them at some point in the past. So the species we see today, like giraffes and chimps and humans, always had parents that were just like the forms today. So giraffes always had giraffe parents back to the mind of God. Likewise with chimps and humans. So the lines of ancestry never converged. So God designed each species to survive in their respective environmental conditions, and this does take design. So the adaptations were evidence of this intelligent design. And then at some point in time, God created all the different species according to the book of Genesis. Now Darwin is going to gather evidence that this story is not correct, that in fact species did change over time. There will be 4 categories of evidence: the fossil record, the geographic distribution of species, comparative anatomy, and classification. And in this lesson we'll just look at the first 2. So we'll say Exhibit A will be the fossil record. Now we'll follow the fossils of the vertebrates. So here we have the 5 major classes of vertebrates. We have fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds. They all have backbones. And we know that when we look at sedimentary rock, we see these layers, and we know that the deeper rock layers are older. And so by inspecting the fossils in these layers, we can see if life changed over time. And in fact, all over the world, you find an interesting pattern in vertebrate fossils in the rocks. In rocks that are young, you find representatives of all the 5 major classes of vertebrates. But as you go deeper into the rock, some of these classes of vertebrates begin to disappear. In very old rocks, you only find fish fossils. And in fact, if you go deeper than that, there are no fish at all. Now this then suggests change over time. Now the fossil record in Darwin's time was not certainly as complete as it is today, but nevertheless Darwin's going to argue that if the fossil record shows this kind of change, then that argues against, that's evidence against the special creation hypothesis. For example, we might expect then, if God really did create all species at some time in the past, according to the book of Genesis, then we would predict all of the vertebrates to be found in all of the rock layers. If they were all created at some point in the past, then fossils of all the different groups should be found in all the layers. So again, Darwin is going to be sort of always in his mind making observations to see how these observations either support or weaken the prevailing view at the time, and that was the special creation hypothesis. So the fossil record weakens the special creation hypothesis and supports the hypothesis of species change over time. Now the vertebrate fossil record suggests something fascinating, that at one point in time there were only fish. They were the only vertebrates on Earth. And then at some later point in time, perhaps tens of millions of years later, we have fish and amphibians. So the fossil record of the vertebrates suggests that some fish evolved into amphibians. And if we go further, some amphibians evolved into reptiles. So again, at this layer here, we have fish and amphibians, and then sometime later we have fish, amphibian, and reptiles. Well, where did the reptiles come from? Now the argument here the biologists are going to make is they more likely came from amphibians than fish, because amphibians and reptiles have more shared characteristics. But again, you see the striking conclusion here, that at one time there were only fish and then there were fish and amphibians. Well, where did the amphibians come from? Perhaps some fish turned into amphibians and some amphibians into reptiles. If we go on up, mammals and birds then can trace their origin back to reptiles. So these are some radical changes in life over the course of millions of years. Now let's focus in on the reptile-to-bird transition. So if some reptiles evolved into birds, there should be fossilized transitional species that have characteristics of reptiles and birds. And paleontologists call these things transitional species or transitional forms. So if some reptiles really did somehow undergo some major transformation into birds, then we would expect, if that took a long time, we would expect to find fossils of some of these intermediate types. And in fact, that's just what we find. So in the mid-1800s, a very interesting specimen was found called Archaeopteryx. And this is a reconstruction of what scientists think Archaeopteryx looked like, but it had some interesting features. So it had feathers like modern-day birds, but its tail had a tailbone like a reptile. So modern birds do not have tailbones, they just have feathers for tails, but this specimen had a tailbone. In addition, Archaeopteryx had teeth. Now modern birds don't have teeth, but reptiles do. And so the suggestion here is that this is an organism that had some characteristics like reptiles, the ancestral group, and some characteristics like birds, the descendant group. So Darwin's going to argue that this is evidence of this major kind of transition, that some reptiles were evolving into birds. Now today we have good evidence that actually birds can trace their lineage to dinosaurs, but of course the dinosaurs going farther back in time would have their origins amongst the reptiles. In summary then, for Exhibit A, the fossil record suggests major changes in life over time, and this weakens the special creation hypothesis.